Everybody, how's it going? It's me, Logan, aka Suburban Yinzer, and right now I'm on top of Mount Washington, aka the Mount in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and right behind me is St. Mary of the Mount Roman Catholic Church. And so I'm going to be doing a video talking about St. Mary of the Mount Church and also St. Justin's. St. Mary of the Mount back here was founded in 1897 up here on Mount Washington on Grandview Avenue. And St. Justin's, which was the sister parish of St. Mary of the Mount, was located on Boggs Avenue. And for many of you that don't realize, St. Mary of the Mount and St. Justin's were two Roman Catholic churches up here on Mount Washington. And for many of you that don't know, St. Justin's closed down back in 2013. But St. Mary of the Mount right here is the current and only basically present Roman Catholic Church, active Roman Catholic Church up here on Mount Washington. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a wee bit closer to the church and talk a wee bit more about the details on it. So St. Mary of the Mount Catholic Church right back here is a very famous church up here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And what's really cool about it is not only is it located here on Mount Washington, and it's very prominent, it's very it stands out very well when you're down on the point or you're going across the bridges. When you look up on Mount Washington, you can see this church up here on Grandview Avenue. But what's really important about this church for me personally is it's not only a Roman Catholic church, but it's also the church and parish of my mother's side of the family up here on Mount Washington. Many of my family members, my immediate family members, meaning my mom, my aunt, and my uncle, not only made their Catholic sacraments at this church, but they also went to school at St. Mary of the Mount, the Catholic school up the street off of Grandview Avenue, up a wee bit more. And so St. Mary of the Mount, the history of the church and the parish, well, before this church was built, it was established in 1873. The original church, made out of wood, was established as a mission up here at St. Mary of the Mount, on Mount Washington. St. Mary of the Mount was actually basically a mission for St. Malachy Church in the south side, so down the hill. So St. Malachy was down on the south side, and many of the parishioners of St. Malachy's were located up here on Mount Washington. But back in the 1870s and 1880s, as many Yins would realize, if you're from Pittsburgh, it was very hard for parishioners or Roman Catholics to get down the mountain. I mean, think about this. You had the Indian steps going down the mountain. Many Yins have seen these steps before. I'll pull up a picture. Very treacherous, and it was just a very, very grueling task to be able to get from up here on Mount Washington all the way down the hill, down the south side. So St. Malachy down the south side said, well, why don't we open a mission and just form a, very, just to say, primitive church up here on Mount Washington for the parishioners to be able to access this easier. So that it happened, and it worked for a while. But in 1877, St. Mary's became a parish with boundaries extending from Grandview Avenue to Warrington Avenue. And the original church was a wooden structure, as I already mentioned, built at the cornerstone of Kearsarge and Belunda Streets. But this current church was founded, or starting to be planned, and the foundation was starting to be laid in 1891 and it was designed by an architect named Friedrich Sauer, or in his German name, Friedrich, or Friedrich, I think, Sauer. So that is German. So he was a German Catholic from Germany. And this was formed in a Gothic architectural style. And since Friedrich Sauer was from Germany, naturally, and he was a German Catholic, he is going to basically form the architectural design from the Roman Catholic churches over in Germany. And that is why when you look at this church and you look at the architectural design style, you can see an almost resemblance to the Roman Catholic churches in Europe, or Germany specifically, or France, or basically Western Europe. So to give a little bit more specifics, to give more specific on Frederick Sauer, the architect and designer of St. Mary of the Mount back here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to highlight a little bit of the architecture for a wee bit of St. Mary of the Mount. Look at that. It is honestly a beautiful piece of architecture and design right here. And hey, not to get too biased, but as a Roman Catholic, I can admit that our church is really pop, if you know what I mean. I mean, the design and architecture of Roman Catholic churches, especially all over the world, it just stands out like a sore thumb. It's amazing. But Frederick Sauer, being a German Catholic from Germany, was born in 1860 in Heidelberg, Deutschland, or aka Germany. And he died in 1942 in Aspinwall, Pennsylvania. He moved to Pittsburgh from Germany in 1880 and established a Pittsburgh office in 1884. He established the Aspinwall Delafield Land Company in 1904. Grandview Avenue is one of the busiest places I've ever walked on in my life. I mean, there's always people zooming up and down. It's amazing. But regardless, that's my only complaint. But regardless, he built and designed a dozen churches in the Pittsburgh area, and some of the prominent famous churches and architectural design styles that he incorporated were St. Stanislaus Kostka in the Strip District, St. Mary of the Mount up here in Mount Washington, St. Mary Magdalene in Homestead, Latimer School in Northside, St. Nicholas Croatian Catholic School in Troy Hill, and St. Nicholas Croatian Church in Millvale. So that's some of the more famous and prominent designs and architectural foundations of Frederick Sauer, the architect of St. Mary of the Mount. So this church right here was dedicated on December 19th, 1897. And this church was built by, basically the funding and the building of this church was by German Catholics, Irish Catholics, and Italian Catholics, immigrants, to be specific. And if you go up on the honor roll from World War I, you could see many of these parishioners have, here comes the Mount Washington wind coming up. You can hear it. You can probably hear in the friggin' microphone. That's because of the Mount Washington wind. Very famous. I've been up here 1,000 times. Don't mind it, okay? Just ignore it. So many of these German, Irish, and Italian immigrants, like I said, were parishioners and helped build and basically incorporate this church. And so these immigrants and these parishioners were looking for a cleaner environment. So they were escaping the more rugged parts of the lowlands of Pittsburgh, like meaning south side on the Monongahela. So they were basically relocating up here on Mount Washington to escape the mills and the clutteredness and just to say the dirtiness of the city. Not to say that it was a bad thing whatsoever. I'm not complaining about that because industry is really good. But these people wanted to relocate up on Mount Washington because it was farther, as you can see right here, from downtown Pittsburgh. I mean, think about it. Back in the day, like back in the 1890s and 1900s, Pittsburgh was was full of soot and smog, and these immigrants and these people wanted to escape from it, and they relocated up here on Mount Washington. So that's the reason why of the foundation of St. Mary of the Mount Church. So when the Mon Incline, aka the Monongahela Incline, going that way, so I'm going to point down. So if you go that way on Grandview Avenue, that's the Monongahela side, the incline side, and going down that way is the Duquesne Incline side. So basically, with the foundations or the foundings of the Monongahela and Duquesne inclines, which I will post a picture for many of yins that aren't from Pittsburgh, you're going to go, what is an incline? Well, you've probably seen famous, prestigious pictures of downtown Pittsburgh or the Point with the incline going down. To be specific, that is the Duquesne Incline. But with the foundation or the founding of these amazing inventions, the Mon Incline in 1870 and the Duquesne Incline in 1876, people from below the mountain, they could come up the incline and attend Mass here at St. Mary of the Mount Church. So by 1871, there were 2,200 people living on Mount Washington, which I think is a pretty interesting fact. So the land on which the current church, which is this church, this was owned by Abraham Kilpatrick, and he bought it from the Penn family in 1794. And if yins are very familiar, or you heard of the Whiskey Rebellion in southwestern Pennsylvania, Abraham Kilpatrick owned a farm up here on Mount Washington back in the 1790s, and the Whiskey Rebels, primarily from Washington County, south of Pittsburgh, came up here, and to the best of my knowledge, they burnt down his farm and his house because he was a Federalist who was supporting the whiskey tax on the whiskey stills in southwestern Pennsylvania. But that's just a side note. But it's really cool that that history was associated with Mount Washington. So, So basically, with the increasing population of parishioners and people up here on Mount Washington, the Catholic Church had to establish a second Roman Catholic Church on Mount Washington, and that was in 1917. That is St. Justin the Martyr Catholic Church, which was founded on Boggs Avenue, and it lasted from 1917 to its closing in 2013. But sadly, by the 1970s, Pittsburgh experienced a big population decline based on the industry and the steel mills basically escaping Pittsburgh. So the parishioners, as you would expect, many of the parishioners were escaping Pittsburgh based on the decline of industry and the steel mills in the 70s and 80s. So the Catholic populations basically in Pittsburgh and many other industrial towns here in the East Coast were experiencing a decline. So that caused a huge Catholic transformation, and the diocese and the Catholic Church in general across America had to make basically big transitions and big moves in order to adapt to this population decline in industrial cities like Pittsburgh. So sadly, by 2012, declining mass attendance all over the country, but especially here on Mount Washington, St. Justin's, and St. Mary the Mat, basically not only declining mass attendance, but also rising building maintenance costs made it impractical for the Diocese of Pittsburgh to maintain the two parishes, St. Mary's and St. Justin's. And so on December 14, 2012, Bishop David Zubik issued a decree merging St. Justin's Parish on Boggs Avenue and St. Mary the Mat on Grandview Avenue together. But sadly, the merger took place on February 10, 2013, but on that date, St. Justin's on Boggs Avenue was closed down, leaving St. Mary the Mat behind me, the only Catholic church on Mount Washington. So, to give just a conclusion of what this church means to me, this is just the end of the summary. Well, this church is very prestigious and very important and sentimental to my family, to myself and my family. Just look at the gorgeous architecture on it. I mean, it's amazing. But if you look at St. Mary of the Mat Church back here, you would think, okay, it's just a church, so what? But this is not just a church to me. This is a representation of the union of my parents. Basically, my parents were married here. My dad's from Southside, my mom's from the Mat. As I already mentioned, my mom went to St. Mary's for Catholic school, 1st through 8th grade. And my mom made many of her sacraments in this church. And for many Indians that aren't Roman Catholic, you're going to go, what's a sacrament? But a sacrament is basically like a ritual or basically a special occasion that you do in the Catholic Church. And in the Roman Catholic faith, you have multiple sacraments. You have baptism, reconciliation, communion, confirmation, marriage, holy orders, and last rites. So as a practicing devout Roman Catholic, you have to follow these rituals and these basically requirements in order to be a practicing member and current member of the Roman Catholic Church and Catholic faith. But my mother was baptized at St. Justin's on Boggs Avenue, but she completed her reconciliation, communion, confirmation, and wedding, or marriage per se, at St. Mary the Mat behind me. Not only my mom made many of her sacraments here, but also my uncle made some sacraments at St. Justin's, but some sacraments up here at St. Mary the Mat, and vice versa with my aunt, St. Justin's, and St. Mary the Mat, vice versa. I've attended many masses at both churches, St. Justin's when it was still active when I was a kid, and St. Mary of the Mount up here with my grandparents who currently still live on Mount Washington.